It was a very scary time. I was in the grocery store and I was ready to pick up some bread from the shelf, and somebody I noticed walked behind me, just somebody from the grocery store, and the woman actually spit on my back. And I was surprised, like I didn't realize what happened. I am Suzan Hito. I'm a revert to Islam. I was born and raised in a very small farming village about an hour west of Chicago, Illinois. Basically a village that had two churches, one Methodist, one Lutheran, and I was raised in the Lutheran Church, which is a very conservative branch of Protestantism.
Suzan Hito lahir di desa pertanian yang sangat kecil yang terletak 1 jam sebelah barat Chicago. Ia anak bungsu dari 6 bersaudara. Sedari kecil, keluarganya adalah Kristen yang taat. Tidak hanya hari Minggu, tapi ia dan kelima saudaranya wajib belajar Alkitab setiap Rabu malam.
I'm the youngest of 6 children. My oldest sister is 19 years older than I am, and I almost was raised like an only child. My family was very committed to their faith and attending church, and it included not only Sundays, but Bible study on Wednesday nights, and most of the community activities revolved around the church community. My childhood, I would hope, was very similar to how I raised my children. Very faith-centered, strong belief in God and understanding our place, like we are here to serve and worship. My parents were very giving and supportive to the community around them. They were accepting, loving, and supporting all the people around them.
Ketika ia mulai tekun pelajari Alkitabnya, Suzan menemukan salah satu dari ayat Injil yang seharusnya dikerjakan oleh umatnya, tapi Kristen sendiri tidak menjalankannya. Suzan akhirnya memutuskan untuk bertanya pada profesornya, tapi jawaban yang dia dapat tetaplah jawaban yang tidak masuk akal.
The greatest questioning came when I went to university and started seeing people from other cultures, other religions, and I think the turning point was actually at Concordia, being a Christian-based university. We had to study the Bible in depth, meaning looking at each chapter, looking at the translation, where it's coming from, the Greek and the Latin. And I had an Old Testament class, meaning the older books of the Bible, basically the Torah section. And we came to a Bible verse that talks about covering and worship. And in the particular Bible verse, it says, before translation into modern English, it says a woman should cover when she worships. So I asked the professor, I said, how do we go from covering our heads when we worship to not having to cover? And he said, well, this is something old from the Bible and we really don't have to do that anymore. I said, but if God says we need to cover when we worship, and Christianity believes that everything we do is worship, then why did we lose that habit of covering? And he said, I'll have to see you after class. So I got a little bit concerned and I went to his office after class and he told me, what are you doing? And I said, I'm asking questions. He said, there's no room in our religion to ask questions. You must believe that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And he honestly told me, if you cannot believe this, he said, the only place you'll find is hell. I said, excuse me? He said, yes. And then I knew that if we can't question and be logical about our religion, like Islam, then it wasn't right for me. The very cold answer from my religious professor when he told me, if you don't believe in the Bible, you'll go to hell. The Christian community was very ready to push me aside, tell me that I was a sinner, tell me that I was doing something wrong for questioning religion. But the reaction from Muslims, the Muslim friends and students that I knew, was completely different. They were accepting of me whether I was Christian or Muslim or anything. But when I told them that I was considering Islam or even just researching Islam, they were so welcoming, so helpful, and they said, make sure you're comfortable. Don't make any quick decisions.
Sejak saat itulah, dari semua agama, Suzan mulai meneliti tentang Islam. Dalam perjalanannya meneliti Islam, ia kesulitan untuk menemukan buku-buku tentang Islam. Hingga suatu hari ia berjumpa dengan seorang gadis yang bernama Shahada.
As I started my research, I went to the university library and looked for books on Islam. And it had Maududis towards understanding Islam. There was a copy of Quran al-Karim, but only in English. There was no Arabic with it. I knew something wasn't right because obviously the Quran is not revealed in English. So I knew from the religious training that when there are translations, there are problems. So I knew that the translation of Quran in English only wasn't enough. So I went to the public library in the neighborhood. And again, very little literature or books or information for me to continue my research. So I went back to my friends and said, where am I going to get books? I need to know more about Islam. And they just kind of, okay, sure. They didn't know what to do about that. And finally, I asked one girl, Shahada. I was in her room and I had seen her pray in her dorm room. I asked her, where, do you know where I can go to find your church? And she laughed. She said, we don't have churches, we have mosques. There's one very close if you want to go. So I said, okay, but don't I have to cover my head? And she laughed at me. She said, okay. So I actually borrowed her prayer scarf and she said, you don't have to. And I said, okay, I understand. But when I went and stood for the bus, I put on my prayer scarf, which was kind of funny because it covered all the way to my knees. And I'm sure I was a sight. But I got on the bus and I went down 95th Street in Chicago until I got to the Mosque and Islamic Center there. And I wasn't sure where to go in. Of course, I went in the wrong door, men only. And I was quickly told, no, use the sisters' entrance. When I heard the adhan, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and I knew what the words meant. But when I looked around at the beauty of the mosque and heard those words, I suddenly felt so small and everything else so big. It was the place for me. And of course, as I was standing there were sisters rushing in for this namaz, and they were like pushing me in line, just get in line. And one sister put her shoulder very close to mine, and I had no idea what I was doing. And she asked me, do you know how to pray? And I said, no. And so I sort of made the movements, even though I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have my hands in the right position. And she just tapped me after the prayer was finished, and she said, you'll get the hang of it. And that was my first introduction to actual Islamic worship. Immediately after the Friday prayer, I went to the Imam's office and asked about where I could get books about Islam. And he was kind of businesslike. I'm sure he was very busy because it's Friday prayer and he didn't want to be caught with a young woman in his office. Lots of men were waiting for him. But he directed me to the library, and that's where I was very happily met by the librarian who gave me lots of books about Islam.
Dan ketika Suzan membaca buku yang mengutip tentang fakta-fakta ilmiah yang ada dalam Al-Quran dan yang tidak ditemukan dalam Injil, timbullah kekagumannya pada Al-Quran. Karena menurutnya, bagaimana mungkin Al-Quran kuno ini dapat tahu dan mampu menjelaskan secara rinci tentang penciptaan manusia secara biologis yang bahkan pada saat itu dokter saja belum menemukannya.
In the research process, I read an incredible book called The Bible, Quran, and Science. This book takes scientific fact and compares it to what's in the Bible and verses of the Quran. So it came from probably Surah Al-Alaq, talking about the creation, how biologically a drop becomes congealed blood, becomes bone surrounded by flesh. And this is given to us in the Quran. In the Bible, it's nowhere to be found. But the Quran so delicately explains this biological process that even, 150, 200 years ago, doctors were just discovering how this whole process occurs. That's something that you can't deny. That our Creator revealed to the believers this process.
Dan pada saat itu pula Suzan akhirnya memantapkan hati untuk bersyahadat.
When science was so far behind. So this was probably, at that point, I remember reading it. I had been newly married. When I read this in the book, I just started weeping. Like tears would not stop. My husband, we were very newly married at the time. I called him and I said, I have to do this. And he's like, calm down, you're crying too much. What's the problem? And I said, I know I need to be a Muslim. And he said, wait a minute. He said, I've never done this before. I was born a Muslim. I don't know anything about this. He said, please call Sheikh Jamal. He said, tell him that you're ready, to make this decision. But he told me, please make sure. I said, I'm sure. And I said, I need to make my Shahada tonight. And he said, simple. I said, what do you mean? I want something like, what do I do? What do I do? He said, tell me. I said, what should I tell you? He said, say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu Muhammadar Rasulullah. And I did. He said, okay, now you have to tell me in English so I can be sure that you know what it means. And so he said, repeat after me. And I did. And that was it. And I said, that's all I have to do to be Muslim? And he said, welcome to Islam.
Semenjak bersyahadat, Suzan merasa beruntung. Ia merasa mudah beradaptasi dalam lingkungan di status barunya itu. Keluarganya tidak menentang keputusannya berpindah ke Islam. Teman-temannya dari pergaulan namanya juga tidak masalah dan tahu bagaimana harus memperlakukan Suzan yang pada saat itu sudah mengenakan hijab.
Basically took Shahada probably on a Thursday or Friday afternoon, and the very next day I wore my hijab. It was a bit overwhelming. Of course, I was proud to do it because I felt it was my obligation as being a Muslim. But at the same time, by choosing to do so, immediately I became non-American. And many people would say, you don't have to wear that, you're American. Put it aside. You don't need to do that. But you can be Muslim and American too. Or you can be Muslim and whatever nationality you are. So I felt a bit shy, but at the same time, I knew what the reason for it was. And it really did serve its purpose. It helped remind me that I'm special in my creation and in the universe. That has to be protected. And I need to protect that. I can't expect anybody to do that for me. It's a personal statement. And that's how I felt about it.
Namun, tak semudah kita yang tinggal di negara mayoritas meluk agama Islam, Suzan sering menghadapi Islamofobia di negaranya. Tak hanya ketakutan yang ia rasakan, tapi juga merasa tertekan karena bahkan seorang pernah meludahi punggungnya karena melihat ia berhijab.
It was a very scary time. I was in the grocery store and I was ready to pick up some bread from the shelf, and somebody I noticed walked behind me, just somebody from the grocery store, and the woman actually spit on my back. And I was surprised, like I didn't realize what happened. And I walked to the front of the store and I was obviously very upset. And the cashier, she said, "Are you okay?" And I told her, that lady who just left, she actually spit on me. And the lady looked at me surprised and she said, "Do you want me to call the police?" And I said, No, I don't want to cause any trouble today. And she said, "No, you need to call the police." And I said, "No, please don't." But I don't know, I've had mixed feelings about this because as a community we were already feeling the pressure of being suspects, and I didn't want to propel that. So this was probably the worst of the Islamophobia, and I've had lots and lots of positive experiences with Americans as a Muslim in the United States. So I would say that was truly an exception and not the general situation.
Tapi selain banyaknya perlakuan-perlakuan buruk itu, Suzan berkata lebih banyak pula orang Amerika yang menghormatinya sebagai seorang Muslim.
If you want to really be in tune to your creator and creation, Islam is the way. But it takes an open heart and an open mind. But it will take you to the path of understanding your creator and creation.